Sarah Martinez stared at the rejection letter in her trembling hands, the words blurring through her tears. "We regret to inform you that your application for the Advanced Leadership Program has been declined. Your academic performance and leadership potential do not meet our current standards." The letterhead bore the seal of the most prestigious government training institute in the country, and, with it, her dreams seemed to crumble into dust. At 25, Sarah had already faced more rejection than most people experience in a lifetime. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of East Cleveland, she was the daughter of a factory worker who cleaned office buildings at night to make ends meet. Her father, Miguel, had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but hope and a willingness to work 18-hour days. Her mother, Rosa, took in laundry from wealthy families, her fingers permanently stained from years of handling harsh detergents and bleach. The Martinez family lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment where the heating rarely worked in winter and the air conditioning was a luxury they couldn't afford in summer. Sarah shared a room with her two younger brothers, Carlos and Diego, while her parents slept on a pull-out couch in the living room. Money was always tight, and Sarah learned early that wanting something and getting it were two very different things. Despite the challenges, Sarah had always been different from her peers. While other kids played video games or watched television, she buried herself in books borrowed from the public library. She devoured stories about great leaders, successful businesspeople, and politicians who had risen from humble beginnings to change the world. Her favorite book was about a young woman who had grown up poor but eventually became a senator, fighting for the rights of working families just like her own. In high school, Sarah's teachers noticed her potential immediately. She had a natural ability to bring people together, to see solutions where others saw only problems, and to speak with a confidence that belied her circumstances. When conflicts arose between students, they often turned to Sarah to mediate. When group projects needed organizing, Sarah naturally took charge. Her English teacher, Mrs. Peterson, frequently told her that she had the makings of a great leader. But potential and opportunity are two different things, and Sarah learned this lesson painfully throughout her academic career. When she applied for scholarships to attend college, her applications were lost in bureaucratic shuffles or overlooked in favor of students from more privileged backgrounds. When she finally managed to enroll in community college while working two part-time jobs, her grades suffered because she was too exhausted to focus properly on her studies. The Advanced Leadership Program represented everything Sarah had ever dreamed of. It was an elite government initiative designed to identify and train future leaders in public service. Graduates of the program often went on to work in the White House, serve as advisors to governors and senators, or lead major government agencies. For someone from Sarah's background, acceptance into the program would have been like winning the lottery. She had spent months preparing her application, staying up late after her shifts at the local diner where she served coffee and cleaned tables. Her personal essay had been rewritten dozens of times, each draft an attempt to capture her passion for public service and her determination to make a difference in the lives of people like her family. She had asked her community college professors for letters of recommendation, and they had written glowing reviews of her character and potential. But none of it had mattered. The rejection letter made it clear that her community college degree, her modest grades affected by financial stress, and her lack of connections in influential circles had sealed her fate. She was not the type of person they were looking for. She was not worthy of their investment. Sarah's mother found her crying at the kitchen table that evening. The rejection letter crumpled beside a cold cup of coffee. Rosa sat down next to her daughter, her worn hands gentle as she smoothed Sarah's hair. "Mija," she said softly, "sometimes the world tries to tell us we're not good enough. But the world doesn't know what we know. It doesn't know how strong we are." But strength felt useless in that moment. Sarah had applied to dozens of other programs and positions, all with similar results. Government internships, nonprofit leadership roles, even entry-level positions at advocacy organizations. Every door seemed to slam shut before she could even get her foot in it. The message was always the same. She didn't have the right background, the right education, or the right connections. Her younger brother Carlos, now a senior in high school, watched his sister's struggles with growing concern. "Maybe you should try something else," he suggested one evening as Sarah hunched over her laptop, frantically searching for new opportunities. Maybe this whole leadership thing isn't meant to be. The word stung because Sarah had begun to wonder the same thing herself. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was reaching too high, dreaming too big. Maybe a girl from East Cleveland with a community college degree and No family connections, had no business thinking she could change the world. But giving up felt like betraying everything her parents had sacrificed for. Miguel worked double shifts at the factory so his children could have opportunities he never had. Rosa's hands were permanently damaged from years of harsh cleaning chemicals because she believed education was the path to a better life. How could Sarah abandon her dreams when her parents had given up so much to make them possible? The breaking point came during a particularly humiliating job interview at a local nonprofit organization. The position was for an assistant coordinator role, barely above an internship, but Sarah was desperate for any foothold in the public service sector. The interviewer, a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled hair and expensive clothes, looked at Sarah's resume with barely concealed disdain. "I see you went to community college," she said, making it sound like an accusation. "And your work experience is primarily in food service. Tell me, what makes you think you're qualified for a role in organizational leadership?" Sarah had prepared for this question, but something in the woman's tone made her feel small and ashamed. She stammered through her response, talking about her volunteer work and her passion for helping others. But she could see in the interviewer's eyes that the decision had already been made. She was wasting everyone's time. "We'll be in touch," the woman said with a dismissive smile, but Sarah knew she would never hear from them again. As she walked out of the building, she felt something inside her break. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she really was useless. That night, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of giving up entirely, she decided to apply for one last program, a small, relatively unknown training initiative run by a government agency she had barely heard of. The National Emergency Response Coordination Center was offering a 6-month intensive training program for potential disaster relief coordinators. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't prestigious, and it definitely wasn't the advanced leadership program she had dreamed of. But it was something, and something was better than the nothing she had been getting everywhere else. The application process was surprisingly simple. No lengthy essays about her leadership philosophy, no requests for letters of recommendation from prominent community leaders she didn't know. Just basic information about her background, her work experience, and a straightforward question about why she wanted to help in emergency situations. Sarah wrote her response honestly. She talked about growing up in a neighborhood where emergencies were a regular part of life. Power outages that lasted for days, apartment fires that left families homeless, flooding that turned streets into rivers. She wrote about watching her neighbors help each other through crisis after crisis, and how she had always felt called to be part of that kind of service on a larger scale. When she submitted the application, she didn't allow herself to hope too much. Hope had become a luxury she couldn't afford. But 3 weeks later, she received a phone call that changed everything. "Ms. Martinez, this is Jennifer Walsh from the National Emergency Response Coordination Center. We've reviewed your application for our training program, and we'd like to offer you a position." Sarah had to sit down. After months of rejection, the simple word, yes, felt almost foreign. "Are you sure?" she asked, immediately regretting how desperate she sounded. Jennifer Walsh laughed kindly. "Very sure. Your background and perspective are exactly what we're looking for. Can you start in 2 weeks?" As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Maybe this wasn't the path she had originally planned, but it was a path forward. And sometimes, that's all you need to change everything. The National Emergency Response Coordination Center training facility looked nothing like Sarah had imagined. Located in a nondescript building complex outside Washington, D.C., it resembled a community college more than the prestigious government academies she had seen in movies. The paint was peeling in places, the carpets were worn thin from years of foot traffic, and the fluorescent lights hummed with an irritating buzz that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Sarah arrived on her first day with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that made her stomach churn. She had packed her few professional clothes into a borrowed suitcase and taken the Greyhound bus from Cleveland to D.C., spending 14 hours watching the landscape change from urban decay to farmland to the outskirts of the nation's capital. The bus ride had cost most of her savings, but her mother had pressed an envelope of crumpled bills into her hands at the last minute. Money Rosa had been saving for a new washing machine. "Make us proud, Mija," her father had whispered as he hugged her goodbye at the bus station. His hands still smelled like motor oil from his factory job, and Sarah held on to that familiar scent as she stepped into the unknown. The other trainees were already gathering in the orientation room when Sarah arrived, and she immediately felt the familiar sting of not belonging. There was Bradley Thompson from Yale, whose father was a federal judge, and whose confidence filled the room like expensive cologne. Madison Winters had graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown and spoke with the polished accent of someone who had never had to worry about money. James Chun had a master's degree in public administration from Harvard and carried himself with the ease of someone who had always been told he was destined for greatness. And then there was Sarah Martinez from East Cleveland, with her community college degree and her second-hand blazer that was slightly too big in the shoulders. The program coordinator, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, no relation, despite sharing a surname, addressed the group of 20 trainees with the kind of authority that comes from years in government service. She was a stern woman in her 50s who had worked her way up from emergency dispatch to running major disaster relief operations across the country. "You are here," Dr. Martinez began, "because someone believes you have the potential to save lives. Over the next 6 months, you will be tested physically, mentally, and emotionally. You will learn to coordinate massive relief efforts, manage limited resources under extreme pressure, and make decisions that affect thousands of people. Some of you will thrive. Others will not make it to graduation." Her eyes swept the room, and Sarah felt exposed under that penetrating gaze. This is not a theoretical exercise. Everything you learn here will be put to use in real emergencies affecting real people. If you're here for the prestige or to pad your resume, you're in the wrong place. The first few weeks of training were brutal in ways Sarah hadn't expected. The physical demands were manageable. She had always been strong from years of working multiple jobs, but the academic requirements were overwhelming. The program assumed a level of background knowledge that most trainees had acquired through expensive undergraduate programs in political science, emergency management, or public administration. While her classmates casually referenced theories and frameworks they had learned at prestigious universities, Sarah struggled to keep up with concepts that seemed elementary to everyone else. Game theory, resource allocation models, organizational behavior principles. These were languages her peers spoke fluently, while Sarah felt like she was constantly trying to catch up on conversations that had started years before she arrived. The instructor for strategic planning and resource management, Professor William Ashford, made no effort to hide his disdain for trainees he deemed unprepared. He was a tall, thin man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses who had spent 20 years in federal emergency management before retiring to teach. His classes were legendary for their difficulty, and several trainees had already dropped out after failing his first major examination. "Miss Martinez," Professor Ashford called out during a particularly challenging lecture on multi-agency coordination protocols. "Perhaps you can enlighten us on the optimal resource distribution strategy when dealing with competing priority zones in a large-scale disaster scenario." Sarah's heart raced. She had studied the material for hours the night before, but the way Professor Ashford phrased the question made it sound like a trap. Around her, she could see her classmates shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even Bradley Thompson, who usually dominated class discussions, remained silent. "Well," Sarah began hesitantly, "I think it depends on several factors. The immediate danger to human life would have to be the top priority, regardless of other considerations. But, beyond that, you'd need to consider the infrastructure impact, the potential for secondary disasters, and the resources available in each zone." Professor Ashford's expression didn't change. "And how would you quantify these factors? What analytical framework would you use to make these determinations?" Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment. She knew what she would do instinctively. Prioritize the areas where people were most at risk, get help to the places where it was needed most urgently. But she didn't know the academic terminology that would make her answer sound sophisticated enough for Professor Ashford's standards. I would focus on where people needed help the most," she said quietly, immediately regretting how simplistic it sounded. Several of her classmates snickered, and Professor Ashford's expression grew even more condescending. "Miss Martinez, this is a graduate-level program in emergency management, not a high school civics class. Where people need help the most is not an analytical framework. It's a sentiment." The humiliation burned in Sarah's chest for the rest of the class. As the other trainees filed out, discussing the lecture in terms she still didn't fully understand, Sarah remained in her seat, staring at her notes, and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Madison Winters paused by her desk on the way out. "Don't take it personally," she said with what might have been kindness or condescension. "Ashford is hard on everyone. You'll catch up." But Sarah wasn't sure she would. Every night, she stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning, reading and rereading the assigned materials, looking up unfamiliar concepts on the internet, trying to bridge the educational gap that seemed to widen every day. Her roommate in the dormitory-style housing, a quiet woman named Lisa Park who had studied international relations at Columbia, often found Sarah asleep at her desk with textbooks scattered around her. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Lisa said gently one morning as Sarah woke up with a textbook imprint on her cheek. "Maybe you should get some help. There are tutoring services available." But asking for help felt like admitting defeat. Sarah had always solved her problems through sheer determination and hard work. The idea of needing special assistance to keep up with her classmates was almost unbearable. The practical exercises were where Sarah began to find her footing. When the instructors simulated emergency scenarios and asked the trainees to respond in real time, something clicked for Sarah that didn't happen in the lecture halls. While her classmates debated optimal strategies and consulted their notes for the correct procedures, Sarah's instincts kicked in. During a simulated hurricane response exercise, Sarah was assigned to coordinate evacuation efforts for a fictional coastal town. The scenario was designed to be overwhelming. Limited transportation resources, elderly residents who refused to leave their homes, a hospital that needed to be evacuated but couldn't safely transport critical patients, and a tight timeline before the storm made rescue impossible. While other trainees got bogged down in the bureaucratic protocols and spent precious time trying to follow proper chains of command, Sarah focused on the human elements of the crisis. She identified the community leaders who could convince reluctant residents to evacuate, found creative solutions for transporting hospital patients using school buses fitted with basic medical equipment, and coordinated volunteer efforts to check on isolated elderly residents. "Martinez, how did you know to contact the local churches?" asked the exercise supervisor, Dr. Ellen Rodriguez, as she reviewed Sarah's decisions. "That's not in any of our standard protocols." Sarah looked up from her notes, surprised by the question. "In my neighborhood growing up, whenever there was an emergency, the churches were always the first to respond. People trust their pastors and community leaders more than they trust government officials." It just made sense. Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That kind of cultural insight isn't something we can teach from textbooks." "Where did you grow up?" "East Cleveland," Sarah replied, expecting the usual look of pity or condescension. Instead, Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "That explains a lot. You understand crisis response from the ground level, not just from the administrative perspective. That's valuable." But Professor Ashford's opinion of Sarah didn't improve, despite her success in practical exercises. If anything, her intuitive approach to problem-solving seemed to irritate him further. During a written examination on federal disaster response protocols, Sarah received her lowest grade yet, a D+ that left her dangerously close to failing the course entirely. "Miss Martinez," Professor Ashford said as he handed back her exam, "your understanding of proper procedures is seriously deficient. I strongly suggest you consider whether this program is the right fit for your skill set." The comment stung particularly because Sarah had been working harder than she ever had in her life. She was spending 12 to 14 hours a day studying, attending every optional review session, and seeking out additional materials to supplement her learning. But no matter how hard she worked, she couldn't seem to close the gap between her background and the expectations of the program. That evening, Sarah called her mother for the first time since arriving at the training center. Rosa picked up on the first ring, as if she had been waiting by the phone. "Mija, how are you? Are you eating enough? Are they treating you well?" The familiar warmth of her mother's voice broke something loose in Sarah's chest, and she found herself crying for the first time since arriving in D.C. "Mama, I don't think I can do this. Everyone else is so much smarter than me. They know things I've never even heard of. Maybe I should come home." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Rosa finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Sarah, do you remember when Carlos broke his arm falling off his bike? Do you remember what happened?" Sarah sniffled. "We couldn't afford to go to the emergency room right away. You reset his arm yourself and made a splint out of magazines and duct tape. And do you remember what the doctor said when we finally got to the hospital 2 days later? He said you had done a perfect job. That Carlos's arm would heal better than if they had treated it immediately." "That's right. And why do you think I knew how to do that? Did I go to medical school?" "No. But you learned from taking care of all of us when we got hurt. From necessity." "Exactly. Sometimes the people with the fancy education know the theories, but they don't know how to actually solve problems when everything is falling apart. You know how to solve problems, Mija. You always have." After she hung up the phone, Sarah looked at her reflection in the small mirror above her desk. Her mother was right. She might not know all the academic frameworks and theoretical models, but she understood something that many of her classmates didn't. What it was like when the systems everyone relied on simply didn't work. The next morning, Sarah walked into Professor Ashford's class with a different kind of determination. She might not graduate at the top of her class, but she wasn't going to let anyone convince her that she didn't belong there. She had as much right to be in that room as anyone else, regardless of where she had come from or what her grades looked like on paper. What Sarah didn't know was that her struggles and her persistence were being noticed by people far more important than Professor Ashford. Dr. Martinez had been quietly observing all the trainees, not just in their academic performance, but in their character and resilience. And Sarah's combination of practical wisdom and unwavering determination was exactly the kind of leadership quality the country needed in times of crisis. The crisis that would change everything began on a Tuesday morning in November when Sarah was halfway through her training program. She was sitting in Professor Ashford's Advanced Crisis Communication class, struggling to stay awake after another late night of studying, when her phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Then another. Around the classroom, other phones began buzzing and beeping as emergency notifications flooded in. Professor Ashford paused mid-sentence, his usual stern expression shifting to concern as he checked his own device. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the class, "we have a developing situation. A 7.2 magnitude earthquake has struck the Pacific Northwest. This is not a drill. All training activities are suspended immediately. Report to the Emergency Operations Center for possible deployment." The Emergency Operations Center was unlike anything Sarah had seen during her training. The large, windowless room hummed with urgent energy as dozens of federal employees coordinated response efforts across multiple screens showing satellite imagery, weather patterns, and communication feeds from the affected areas. The scope of the disaster was becoming clear. Seattle and surrounding areas had been severely damaged, with collapsed buildings, broken infrastructure, and thousands of people in immediate danger. Dr. Martinez stood at the center of the controlled chaos, directing operations with the calm efficiency of someone who had managed disasters for decades. When she saw the trainees filing into the room, she quickly assigned them to support various aspects of the response effort. "Martinez," she called out to Sarah, using her last name in the military style that had become standard during training. "You're with the civilian coordination team. We need someone to help manage the volunteer response efforts." Sarah was assigned to work under Janet Kowalski, a veteran emergency coordinator who had been managing disaster responses for 15 years. Janet was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who spoke rapidly and expected people to keep up with her pace of thinking. "Here's the situation," Janet explained as they huddled around a computer terminal showing incoming data from Seattle. "We've got thousands of volunteers showing up at disaster sites with no coordination. Churches, community groups, private citizens with pickup trucks. Everyone wants to help, but they're getting in the way of professional rescue operations. We need to organize them effectively without wasting time on bureaucratic procedures." This was exactly the kind of problem Sarah understood instinctively. While her classmates had been studying organizational charts and command structures, Sarah had grown up in a community where people helped each other without waiting for official permission or proper channels. She knew how informal networks operated, how to identify natural leaders within communities, and how to get things done when the official systems weren't working. "What if we set up staging areas away from the primary disaster sites?" Sarah suggested. "Let the volunteers gather there, then organize them into teams based on what they can actually do. Use local community leaders to manage each staging area instead of trying to coordinate everything from here." Janet looked up from her computer screen with interest. "Go on. Most of these volunteers probably live in the area or nearby. They know the neighborhoods. They know which roads are passable. They know where people might need help. Instead of treating them as obstacles, we could use them as our local intelligence network." Janet was quiet for a moment, processing the idea. Around them, other coordinators were struggling with the same problem: how to manage the chaos of well-intentioned volunteers without slowing down professional rescue operations. "You know what?" Janet said finally. "That might actually work. Can you help me draft a proposal for Dr. Martinez?" For the next 4 hours, Sarah worked more intensively than she had during any training exercise. She helped identify locations for volunteer staging areas, drafted protocols for organizing civilian response teams, and created communication chains that could function even when official channels were overloaded. Her experience growing up in a community that couldn't always rely on official help proved invaluable in designing systems that could work in chaotic, resource-limited situations. When they presented their proposal to Dr. Martinez, Sarah felt the familiar nervousness that came with being put on the spot by authority figures. But this time, she was confident in her ideas because they were rooted in real experience rather than academic theory. The key, Sarah explained, is to work with the community's existing social structures instead of trying to impose new ones. People are already organized into churches, neighborhood groups, local businesses. We just need to connect those existing networks to our operations. Dr. Martinez studied the proposal carefully, asking detailed questions about implementation and potential challenges. Other senior coordinators gathered around to listen as Sarah explained how local knowledge could be leveraged to improve response efficiency. This is innovative thinking, Dr. Martinez said finally. Martinez, I want you to take point on implementing this. Kowalski will provide oversight, but you'll be responsible for making it work. The next 72 hours were a blur of phone calls, coordination meetings, and real-time problem solving. Sarah found herself talking to community leaders across the Pacific Northwest, explaining the volunteer coordination system and helping them organize local response efforts. She spoke with pastors who were already organizing their congregations to check on elderly neighbors, business owners who had equipment and resources to contribute, and neighborhood leaders who knew which families might need special assistance. What surprised Sarah most was how naturally the leadership role came to her when she was dealing with actual people facing real problems. All the academic frameworks that had seemed so intimidating in Professor Ashford's classroom faded into the background when she was focused on connecting resources with needs, organizing effective communication, and solving practical problems under pressure. Sarah, we've got a problem in the Ballard neighborhood, Janet called out during their second day of operations. The staging area coordinator there says they have a group of volunteers ready to help, but they don't know where to send them. Sarah pulled up the neighborhood information on her computer. Let me call the contact person there. Sometimes these situations need a human conversation rather than a digital solution. When she reached Mike Chun, a local business owner who was coordinating volunteers in his neighborhood, she could hear the frustration in his voice. We've got 30 people here with trucks and supplies, but every official channel we contact tells us to wait for instructions. Meanwhile, we know there are families trapped in damaged buildings just a few blocks away. Mike, here's what we can do, Sarah said. I need you to break your volunteers into teams of 5 or 6. Send one team to check on the families you know about, but only to assess the situation and report back, not to attempt any rescues that require professional equipment. Send another team to establish communication with other neighborhood groups. We need to know what's happening in areas where our official channels aren't working. That makes sense, Mike replied. But what about the official protocols? Won't we get in trouble for acting without proper authorization? Sarah looked around the Emergency Operations Center, where dozens of federal employees were working frantically to coordinate an impossibly complex response to an enormous disaster. Mike, the official protocols are designed for normal situations. This isn't normal. What matters right now is helping people safely and effectively. I'll take responsibility for any protocol issues. It was exactly the kind of decision that would have terrified Sarah in a classroom setting, where every answer had to be precisely correct according to established procedures. But in the real world, with real people in danger, the decision felt obvious. The volunteer coordination system Sarah had designed worked better than anyone had expected. Within 48 hours, they had organized over 3,000 volunteers across 15 staging areas, creating an informal but effective network that complemented professional rescue operations. Local knowledge proved invaluable in identifying priority areas, finding safe routes through damaged infrastructure, and locating people who needed help but weren't on any official lists. Dr. Martinez began stopping by Sarah's workstation regularly, not to check on her work, but to get updates on how the volunteer network was functioning. Martinez, your system is outperforming our traditional approaches in several key metrics, she said during one of these check-ins. Response times are faster, resource allocation is more efficient, and we're reaching people who might have been missed by conventional operations. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. On Thursday evening, as the immediate crisis response was winding down and transitioning to recovery operations, Professor Ashford appeared at Sarah's workstation. She looked up, expecting criticism or correction of her methods. Instead, he was holding a printout of communication logs from the Volunteer Coordination Network. Miss Martinez, I've been reviewing your work over the past few days, he said, his usual condescending tone replaced by something that might have been respect. Your approach to resource allocation and community coordination demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of organizational behavior principles, even if you don't use the academic terminology. Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. Thank you, Professor. I owe you an apology, he continued. I assumed that your unconventional background meant you lack the analytical skills necessary for this field. I was wrong. You understand these concepts at a practical level that many of our graduate school-trained coordinators struggle to achieve. That evening, Sarah called her mother again. But this time the conversation was very different. Mama, I think I might actually be good at this. Rose's laughter came clearly through the phone. Mija, I never doubted that. The question was never whether you were good enough. The question was whether you would believe in yourself enough to show everyone else what I already knew. But the real surprise came the following Monday, when training resumed, and Sarah returned to her regular classes. Dr. Martinez pulled her aside after the morning briefing. Martinez, I need to discuss something with you. Your work during the earthquake response has been noticed at very high levels within the administration. There's interest in your approach to community-based disaster coordination. How would you feel about presenting your methods to some senior officials in Washington? Sarah's heart skipped. What kind of senior officials? Dr. Martinez smiled in a way that suggested she knew more than she was saying. The kind who make policy decisions about how the federal government responds to emergencies. The kind who are always looking for innovative approaches that actually work in the real world. Sarah thought about Professor Ashford's earlier dismissal of her methods as too simplistic for graduate-level work. She thought about all the rejection letters and condescending interviews that had made her feel like she wasn't smart enough or qualified enough to make a difference. I'd be honored, she said. What Sarah didn't know was that her work had already been noticed by someone much more important than senior officials. In fact, at that very moment, a report about the volunteer coordination innovation was sitting on a desk in the Oval Office, waiting for review by the President of the United States. Sarah was in the middle of Professor Ashford's final examination when the call came. She had been working through a complex scenario involving resource allocation during a multi-state flood emergency, carefully applying all the theoretical frameworks she had struggled to learn during the previous months. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now acing the same type of academic exercises that had nearly caused her to fail earlier in the program. The classroom was silent except for the scratching of pencils on paper and the occasional shuffling of feet. Sarah was double-checking her answers when Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, scanning the room until her eyes found Sarah. She motioned for her to step outside. Sarah's heart sank. Being pulled out of a final exam was never a good sign. She gathered her papers and followed Dr. Martinez into the hallway, expecting to be told about some problem with her work or a disciplinary issue she wasn't aware of. Instead, Dr. Martinez was holding a phone with an expression that Sarah couldn't read. Martinez, I need you to take this call. And I need you to stay calm. Who is it? Sarah asked, accepting the phone with trembling hands. Dr. Martinez took a deep breath. It's the White House. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Sarah stared at the phone as if it might bite her. The White House. Like the actual White House. The actual White House. Specifically, the President's Chief of Staff. He wants to speak with you personally about your work on community-based disaster coordination. Sarah's mouth went dry. Dr. Martinez, I think there's been a mistake. I'm just a trainee. I haven't even graduated yet. Why would the President's Chief of Staff want to talk to me? Because, Dr. Martinez said with a smile that suggested she had been keeping a significant secret. Your earthquake response work has been circulating through the highest levels of government for the past 2 weeks. The President himself requested a briefing on your methods. The phone felt impossibly heavy in Sarah's hands. She had imagined many different ways her training program might end, but receiving a call from the White House had never been one of them. What am I supposed to say? Just be yourself. Answer his questions honestly. And remember, you're not just representing yourself right now. You're representing a new way of thinking about emergency response that could save thousands of lives. With shaking fingers, Sarah answered the call. Hello, this is Sarah Martinez. Ms. Martinez, this is David Chun, Chief of Staff to the President. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, with the kind of authority that came from years of working at the highest levels of government. I apologize for interrupting your examination, but I have something urgent to discuss with you. Yes, sir. Sarah's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Ms. Martinez, are you familiar with the President's National Resilience Initiative? Sarah's mind raced through everything she had learned about current government programs during her training. I'm familiar with some aspects of it, sir, but I'm not an expert. That's perfectly fine. Let me explain why I'm calling. 2 weeks ago, the president received a report about an innovative volunteer coordination system that was implemented during the Pacific Northwest earthquake response. This system significantly outperformed traditional federal response protocols in several key areas. Are you aware that you were the primary architect of this system? Yes, sir. But I had a lot of help from Janet Kowalski and other experienced coordinators. Ms. Kowalski has been very clear that the core innovations were yours. Ms. Martinez, the president is hosting a meeting tomorrow afternoon with emergency response officials from across the country to discuss how we can improve federal disaster response capabilities. He would like you to attend this meeting and present your approach. Sarah had to sit down on a nearby bench. The hallway seemed to be spinning around her. Sir, I'm honored, but I'm still in training. I haven't even graduated from the program yet. Surely there are more qualified people who could present this information. Ms. Martinez, David Chin's voice took on a slightly warmer tone. The president specifically requested that you present your work personally. He's not interested in having someone else interpret your innovations. He wants to hear directly from the person who developed them. Can you be in Washington tomorrow afternoon? Yes, sir. I'm already in Washington, at the training facility. Excellent. Someone from my office will contact you within the hour with details about security clearance and meeting logistics. Ms. Martinez, I want you to understand something. The president doesn't typically invite trainee-level personnel to policy discussions in the Oval Office. This is an extraordinary opportunity. After the call ended, Sarah sat in the hallway for several minutes, staring at the phone in her hands. Dr. Martinez sat beside her, waiting patiently for her to process what had just happened. Dr. Martinez, Sarah finally said, did he say Oval Office? He did indeed. I'm going to meet the president. You are. Sarah looked down at her clothes. The same second-hand blazer she had worn on her first day of training, now showing signs of wear from months of intensive use. I don't have anything appropriate to wear to the White House. Dr. Martinez smiled. We'll figure that out. Right now, I need you to finish your exam. Then, we have work to do. The rest of the examination passed in a blur. Sarah answered the remaining questions mechanically, her mind focused on the impossible reality that in less than 24 hours, she would be sitting in the most powerful office in the world, discussing her ideas with the President of the United States. That evening, Dr. Martinez took Sarah shopping for appropriate attire, using discretionary funds from the training program. They found a conservative but professional suit that fit reasonably well, along with shoes that didn't quite match but were close enough to pass inspection. Sarah, Dr. Martinez said as they sat in her office that night, reviewing materials for the next day's meeting, I want you to understand something. This opportunity isn't just about your individual success. You represent thousands of people who have been told they're not qualified, not educated enough, not sophisticated enough to contribute to important conversations. Tomorrow, you get to prove them wrong. Sarah nodded, but the weight of that responsibility felt overwhelming. What if I mess up? What if I freeze up in front of the president? What if my ideas sound stupid when I'm sitting in the Oval Office instead of managing a real emergency? Your ideas saved lives during the earthquake response, Dr. Martinez replied firmly. They worked better than approaches developed by people with decades more experience and much more impressive credentials. That's not luck, Sarah. That's insight and intelligence. That night, Sarah called her parents to tell them about the meeting. The conversation was surreal, explaining to her father, who cleaned factory floors for a living, that his daughter would be advising the President of the United States on emergency response policy. Miguel was quiet for a long time after she finished explaining. Finally, he said, Mija, your grandfather would be so proud. He came to this country believing his children could have opportunities he never had. But even he never imagined something like this. Rosa was more practical. What will you wear? Do you have good shoes? Make sure you eat something before the meeting. You think more clearly when you're not hungry. But it was Carlos, her younger brother, who had once suggested she should give up on leadership aspirations, who said what Sarah needed to hear most. Sarah, you know what's crazy about this? A year ago, you were crying in our kitchen because some woman at a nonprofit told you that you weren't qualified for an assistant coordinator job. Now the president wants your advice. That's not luck. That's you finally being in a place where people can see what we've always known about you. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with a thin layer of frost covering the windows of the training facility. Sarah woke up at 5 a.m., having barely slept, and spent an hour rehearsing her presentation in the mirror. She had prepared a 15-minute overview of the community-based coordination system, with specific examples from the earthquake response and suggestions for broader implementation. Dr. Martinez drove her to the White House, navigating the security checkpoints, and protocol briefings that preceded any meeting with the president. Sarah's hands were shaking as they went through the metal detectors and background verification processes. "Ms. Martinez," said a young woman in an expensive suit who appeared to be her liaison for the meeting. "The president is running slightly behind schedule, but he's very much looking forward to hearing your presentation. Is there anything you need before we go in?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Just a moment to remind myself that I belong here." The liaison smiled. "For what it's worth, Ms. Martinez, the president specifically said he wanted to meet the person who figured out how to make disaster response work better by treating volunteers as assets instead of obstacles. That's exactly what you did." As they walked through the corridors of the White House, passing portraits of previous presidents and rooms where history had been made for centuries, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the rejection letters and condescending interviews, through the struggles and training and the humiliation of being dismissed as unqualified, to this extraordinary opportunity to share her ideas at the highest level of government. She thought about her mother's words. "Sometimes the world tries to tell us we're not good enough, but the world doesn't know what we know about our own strength." And as they approached the Oval Office, Sarah realized that she did belong here. Not because she had the right credentials or the right background, but because she had ideas that could help people. And, in the end, that was all that really mattered. The Oval Office was smaller than Sarah had expected from seeing it on television, but more impressive in person. The weight of history seemed to press down from the curved walls, and she found herself momentarily frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the realization that she was actually standing in the most powerful office in the world. President James Morrison rose from behind the resolute desk as she entered, and Sarah was struck by how normal he seemed in person. He was taller than she had expected, with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes, but he moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. "Ms. Martinez, thank you for coming," he said, extending his hand with a warm smile. "I've been looking forward to meeting the person behind this innovative disaster response approach." Sarah shook his hand, surprised by how firm but gentle his grip was. "Thank you for having me, Mr. President. I'm honored to be here. Please, have a seat." President Morrison gestured to one of the chairs arranged in front of his desk. "Before we begin, I want you to know that your work during the Pacific Northwest earthquake has already influenced policy discussions at the highest levels. Your community-based coordination model saved lives and resources. That's no small accomplishment." Around the Oval Office, several other officials had gathered for the meeting. Sarah recognized Secretary of Homeland Security Patricia Williams from news coverage, along with FEMA Director Robert Hayes, and the President's Chief of Staff David Chun, whom she had spoken with the previous day. There were others she didn't recognize, but who clearly held important positions based on their confident demeanors and expensive suits. "Ms. Martinez," President Morrison continued, "I'd like you to walk us through your approach. But first, tell me about your background. How did someone who's still in training develop innovations that our veteran emergency managers haven't considered?" Sarah had practiced this moment 100 times, but sitting in the Oval Office with the president's full attention felt completely different from rehearsing in her dorm room. She took a deep breath and decided to be completely honest. "Mr. President, I think my background actually prepared me for this work in ways that traditional education might not have. I grew up in East Cleveland, in a community where the official systems often didn't work. When there was a crisis, a fire, a power outage, a flood, people had to organize themselves to help each other. I learned to recognize how informal networks function, how to identify natural leaders within communities, and how to coordinate resources when there's no central authority managing everything." President Morrison leaned forward, clearly interested. "Go on. When I was working on the earthquake response, I realized that we were treating volunteer efforts as a problem to be managed instead of a resource to be leveraged. In my neighborhood growing up, volunteers weren't obstacles. They were the first responders. They knew the community, they knew who needed help, and they knew how to get things done quickly when time mattered." Sarah pulled out her tablet and began showing the group the data from the Pacific Northwest response. By organizing volunteers through existing community networks, churches, neighborhood groups, local businesses, we were able to coordinate 3,000 people across 15 staging areas in less than 48 hours. Response times improved by an average of 30%, and we reached people who weren't on any official assistance lists. Secretary Williams interrupted. "Ms. Martinez, how do you ensure quality control when you're working with untrained volunteers?" How do you maintain accountability and prevent well-intentioned people from making situations worse? This was exactly the kind of challenge Sarah had anticipated. Secretary Williams, the key is to work with community structures that already exist rather than trying to impose new ones. In most neighborhoods, there are already people who have earned trust and respect, pastors, business owners, longtime residents who everyone knows. These people understand their communities better than any outside coordinator could. She clicked to a specific example from the response data. In the Ballard neighborhood, we worked with Mike Chun, who owns a local hardware store. He had been organizing informal response efforts before we ever contacted him. Instead of trying to replace his work with our protocols, we gave him the resources and information he needed to do what he was already doing more effectively. FEMA Director Hayes looked skeptical. That's fine for small-scale operations, but how does this scale up for major disasters affecting millions of people across multiple states? Sarah had wondered about this question herself during the weeks following the earthquake response. Director Hayes, I think the answer is that it scales down, not up. Instead of trying to coordinate everything from a central location, you create a network of local coordination points. Each community manages its own response using methods that work for them, but they're connected to a larger information and resource sharing system. She pulled up a diagram she had created showing how the model could work at different scales. Think of it like the internet. There's no single computer controlling everything, but all the individual networks are connected and can share information and resources as needed. President Morrison was quiet for several minutes, studying the data and diagrams Sarah had presented. Finally, he looked up and asked a question that surprised everyone in the room. Ms. Martinez, what would you do if I offered you a position working directly for the federal government to implement this approach nationwide? Sarah's heart skipped. She hadn't expected a job offer, certainly not from the president himself. Sir, I haven't even graduated from the training program yet. Graduation is a formality, President Morrison replied. The question is whether you're interested in turning your ideas into policy that could affect how we respond to emergencies across the entire country. Sarah thought about her parents, working multiple jobs to support their family while dreaming of opportunities their children might have. She thought about Professor Ashford, who had dismissed her as unprepared for graduate-level work. She thought about all the rejection letters and condescending interviews that had made her feel like she wasn't good enough to make a difference. Mr. President, I would be honored to serve in whatever capacity you think would be most effective. But I want to make sure I'm qualified for whatever position you have in mind. President Morrison smiled. Ms. Martinez, you just presented a disaster response innovation to the president and his senior staff in the Oval Office. You created a system that outperformed traditional approaches during a major emergency. You've demonstrated leadership under pressure and the ability to think creatively about complex problems. I'd say you're qualified. David Chun leaned forward. Ms. Martinez, what the president is proposing is the creation of a new position within FEMA, Director of Community-Based Response Coordination. Take some time to think about it. Discuss it with your family. Consider what kind of impact you want to have on the world. But I want you to know that this offer is real, and it comes with my full support. As Sarah prepared to leave, President Morrison walked her to the door. Can I ask you something, Ms. Martinez? When you were growing up, did you ever imagine you'd be having this conversation? Sarah laughed, thinking about the cramped apartment in East Cleveland and her parents working multiple jobs to pay rent. No, sir. I dreamed about making a difference, but I never imagined it would happen like this. The best innovations often come from people who see problems differently because they've experienced them differently, President Morrison said. Your background isn't a limitation, Ms. Martinez. It's your greatest qualification. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same Oval Office, but this time she was being sworn in as the youngest director in FEMA's history. Her parents had flown in from Cleveland for the ceremony, her father wearing his only suit and her mother carrying a small American flag that she had bought from the dollar store. As Chief Justice Roberts administered the oath of office, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in one of the office windows. She was wearing a tailored suit now, appropriate for her position, but she could still see traces of the uncertain young woman who had arrived at the training facility with a second-hand blazer and big dreams. The community-based response coordination program that Sarah developed was implemented nationwide within her first year in the position. When Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, the new protocols helped coordinate volunteer efforts that reached communities that might have been isolated for weeks under traditional approaches. When wildfires threatened California communities, Local coordination networks helped evacuate residents more efficiently than ever before. Professor Ashford visited Sarah's office 6 months after her appointment, carrying a thick folder of academic papers. Ms. Martinez, or rather, Director Martinez, I wanted to share some research I've been conducting on your community-based response model. I'm planning to incorporate it into my curriculum as an example of innovative emergency management theory. Sarah smiled, remembering how intimidating Professor Ashford had seemed during those early days of training. Professor, I'd be happy to guest lecture in your class sometime. I think it would be valuable for students to understand that innovation can come from unexpected places. But the moment that meant the most to Sarah came during her first major disaster response as director. A massive tornado had struck a rural area in Oklahoma, and Sarah was coordinating the federal response from the Emergency Operations Center. As she watched the real-time data showing volunteer coordination networks activating across the affected region, her phone rang. Director Martinez, this is Mike Chun from the Ballard neighborhood in Seattle. We heard about the tornado, and our community group wants to send a volunteer team to help with recovery efforts. Can you help us coordinate with the local response operations? The call reminded Sarah that her innovations weren't just policy changes or bureaucratic improvements. They were about connecting people who wanted to help with people who needed help, using the natural networks of trust and cooperation that existed in every community. That evening, Sarah called her parents from her office, looking out at the lights of Washington, D.C. Her mother answered on the first ring, as always. Mija, how are you? Are you eating enough? Are you taking care of yourself? I'm good, Mama. Really good. I wanted to tell you about today's response operations. As she described the tornado response and the volunteer coordination efforts, Sarah realized that she had finally found her place. Not because she had overcome her background or transcended her humble beginnings, but because she had learned to see those experiences as strengths rather than limitations. You know what I'm proudest of? Rosa said when Sarah finished her story. Not that you're important now, though we are proud of that too. I'm proud that you never forgot where you came from or what you learned from us about helping people. Sarah looked around her office, with its government-issued furniture and official seals, and thought about the cramped apartment in East Cleveland where she had first learned that helping your community wasn't just the right thing to do. It was the most important thing you could do. She had been written off as useless by people who didn't understand her potential. But the president had reached out mid-training because he recognized something that others had missed. Sometimes the best solutions come from people who understand problems from the ground up, not from the top down. And sometimes, the girl from East Cleveland with the community college degree and the second-hand blazer has exactly the insight the country needs to solve its most pressing challenges.